Good morning, my brothers and sisters.
Good morning, Brother John.
So, a few details. Thank you very much for your attention to the material. All the books have gone. There's none left. So, if you want one still for yourself or for a friend, there's a little sign-up sheet at the back, and what I'll do is I'll get them mailed to you still at this reduced price if you sign up at the Bible school. Alternatively, that URL just says johnpople.com, and that will take you to my website where pretty much all of my stuff exists, hopefully. And if you click, you probably can't read it, but the second tab there says books. So if you click on books, it'll bring up that page, and the books I've written will come down, and the newest one, which is this one, will be at the top of the list. Okay? So that's at least two different ways you can get hold of another copy of the book if you want. Theoretically, the PowerPoint slides will be on here as well, but don't trust that. I'll email them to you if you email me. My email address is here, been up previously. So, Born to Rule, Esther's story. That's the main thrust of today, but 2 days ago, I was supposed to present on Rachel and Delilah, but unfortunately Rachel, diva that she is, shoved Delilah clean out of the class and took over, as she's always wont to do. So what I've done is I've cut down the Esther class a little bit and cut down the Delilah class quite a lot, and just so that we could just have a little taste of some of the things that I found stunning about a new look at Delilah. So we'll start off with just a few thoughts about Delilah. Her story I entitle, for a reason that will become very apparent, Blood Money. Delilah's situation. So we looked at Rachel, a favorite Israelite bride, and end up discovering that there was a lot darker view of Rachel that we probably need to take. Not that I rejoice in presenting anyone in the scriptures in a darker light than we might have assumed, but we want to know the truth, be it ugly, be it pretty, whatever. And now we look at the second half of that, or just a little snatch of it, Blood Money. Delilah is always assumed to be a heartless, hired seductress, and there's an element of that which is true. But there's actually also a way we can see her in a slightly sympathetic light if we realize the tail end of the story. The tail end of her story has been cut off, almost literally, by a chapter break. Chapter breaks are one of the biggest hazards in Scripture to understanding. Only about 150 of them are real, the rest are just invented. And they're quite often put in the middle of a story, and so you end up not reading the end. The chapter break at the end of Judges chapter 16 is the verse after Samson dies. And all that tells you is whoever put in the chapter breaks is a man, not a woman. Because he's like, oh, the man's dead, story over. And he cuts it off. But actually it runs on, and there's some more to see. Let's get into the heart of the matter, though. Samson and Delilah. We won't repeat the basics of the story. We've known it since Sunday school days. Delilah has been hired by the Philistine lords and other conspirators to find out the secret to Samson's unnatural strength. And the answer to the secret is it's in his hair, which he wears in 7 braids. The Bible tells us he wears 7 long braids, and he hasn't cut his hair from the Nazirite vow, and that is the source of his strength. And Delilah pesters Samson again and again, what is the source of your strength? And 3 times, the first 3 times, he deceives her. And the first time, he said, well, if you tie me up with 7 bowstrings, I will become as weak as any other man. You know this. Why are we reviewing well-known material? Stop and think. It's not a very good lie, right? Now, it's not my job to teach you how to be really good liars. It's not what you come to Bible school for, really. But I mean, why would you say, if the source of your strength is the 7 hair braids, why would you go and say 7 bowstrings? There's a slight similarity, isn't there? Why wouldn't you say, oh, make up a potion made out of these ingredients and I'll become as weak as another man? No, he doesn't. In fact, the second time that he lies to her, it's even worse. He says, tie me up with new ropes. There is nothing on the planet that looks more similar to braided hair than rope. In fact, this could be a photograph of braided hair. It's actually a photograph of rope, but they're so similar. So again, worst lie ever. This guy has absolutely got no idea. And the final time that he lies to her, he says, well, the source of my great strength, it's something to do with the 7 braids of my hair. So it's even worse. So he's getting closer and closer. So we could say, oh, look, Samson obviously has a very low intellect. I don't think that's the case. I think we actually need to look at this with a sense of pathos. The reason that he's telling her lies that are so similar to the truth, every one of his lies actually points at the truth, is because he desperately wants to tell her. And he wants to trust her that she won't end his life by betraying him. And so he's inching closer and closer and closer to the truth. The final lie is about his 7 hair braids, but he doesn't tell her to cut them off. He tells them to weave them into a loom or tie them to the rafters of the house. The Hebrew is a little unclear, doesn't matter. He's directed her to the actual source of the problem. And I think that's what we see in Samson, a deep pathos. This is a man who just wants to find a lover with whom he can share his secrets. And he's realizing that Delilah just repeatedly reveals her treachery. Because every time he gives her a clue of, do this and I will be reduced, and by morning when she shouts, Samson, the Philistines are upon you, why, the very thing he's told her will reduce him to nothing has happened to him. So he knows it's her. In fact, I don't know if you've ever read closely enough, you can see from the language that he uses that he knows it's her. Look, you can see it from his pronouns. The first time, the bowstrings, he says, if they, who's they? They is the Philistines, right? If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, then whatever. The second time, after that's happened, he says, if they bind me with new ropes, then I'm reduced. But the third time, either by accident or design, he says, if you weave the 7 braids of my head. He knows it's her. You can see the pronouns give it away when it transitions. So there is a deep pathos in this, that he's wanting to tell her the truth. And finally he does, to his own destruction. He's not a fool, he just risked so much, and she had no intention, or at least no opportunity, to let him survive. Here was the deal. The rulers of the Philistines went to Delilah and said, see if you can lure Samson into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can capture him. If so, each one of us, every one of us, will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. I haven't bothered to do the mathematics of what that comes down to in modern terms. It's a huge amount of money. And it's 1,100 pieces of silver multiplied by the number of conspirators, which the Lord of the Philistines is 5, and maybe more as well. So it's just a massive fortune. Ask yourself this. Was Delilah ever paid? You might think, well, maybe we don't care, but it does matter a little bit to understand her story, to give her a little bit of voice. Was she ever paid? Let's remember Vashti. Stop and remember her for a minute. What was her story? Her story, because it'll be a very similar dynamic. Vashti, remember, was deposed as queen. And we've got to come into Esther later, so it's kind of handy to have this here. The king, Xerxes I'm going to call him, or Ahasuerus you might know him, Xerxes was having a party. It was 6 months long. And it was all very drunken, and he had all his friends round. And he said, my wife is very beautiful. I'll send her, and she can parade up and down in front of you. You can see, how powerful I am to have such a beautiful wife. And so he sends for Vashti. And she's aware there's just a bunch of drunken royal men, privileged and entitled men, that she's supposed to parade up and down in front of us. And she says, no, I'm not having any of that. I'm not going to come. Now at this point, the king is humiliated. He's supposed to be a ruler over the whole known world at the time, and he can't even get his own wife to come and attend him when he calls for her. So he's absolutely humiliated, which means he's absolutely furious. And so he convenes his advisors and says, what should be done? And so fragile is the patriarchal hold that each man has over their wife that the advisors say, this is a disaster. If you leave this in any way unaddressed, Wives throughout the kingdom will actually stand up to their husbands and demand to be treated with dignity. We can't have this. Now, their logic is sound. Their ethics is a bit off, but their logic is sound. So to maintain control, we have to ensure that Vashti is punished, and punished she was, and tragically, therefore, she was deposed. So if we compare her situation to Delilah, we notice something rather similar. Vashti couldn't remain queen, because otherwise she'd already set the precedent for rebellion against her husband. Consider this case, it's even worse. Imagine, Delilah is married to a politically influential man. I shouldn't say married. Delilah is at least coupled with Samson somehow, and Samson is changing the political landscape. He's not trying to be a politician, but he is a weapon. And as a massive military force in one man, that ends up having massive political influence whether you want it or not. And that's why the rulers of the Philistines have to take him down. But what if in taking him down, they make his woman independently wealthy, lavishly wealthy? They've set a precedent that if you're married to a politically influential man, you can sell him down the river for a huge fortune and live on your own and become massively wealthy. They can't set that precedent. Can you imagine one of the rulers of the Philistines at breakfast with his wife? And the wife asks him, "Hey, whatever happened to Delilah?" "Oh, well, we paid her all the money. She's now completely independently wealthy, and she lives without the trouble of ever having to have a man in her life if she doesn't want to." "Oh, really? Tell me more. How much money?" "Oh, a huge amount of money. Couldn't even count it. All she had to do was sell her politically influential husband." Oh, but pass the butter, right? They can't set that precedent. They'd be putting their own heads in a noose. As much as Vashti could not remain queen after standing up to the king, so after selling her important man into the hands of captivity, Delilah logically cannot remain alive. The conspirators cannot leave her alive. Now, that's just logic. You might like that logic and think, yeah, that makes sense, but surely you're still going to say, what about actually having some biblical evidence for what you say? This is a Bible class, not just a kind of a think tank. Is there any biblical evidence to support what I've suggested? And the answer is yes, there is. Beyond that chapter break. Remember, the contract was, we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. And the verses directly after Samson's death, which foolishly have been punted into the next chapter, a chapter break which is just man-made, are all about 1,100 pieces of silver. Now, you cannot tell me, since that's the only mentions of 1,100 pieces of silver in the entire Bible, it's a very weird, unusual number. You cannot tell me that 1,100 pieces of silver promised to Delilah isn't the same as being argued over in the next verses after Samson's death. Of course it is. It's a continuation of the same story. What is being said? You can read the verses, I've kind of clipped them a bit. Let me paraphrase for you to make the point. The story is this. It's a mother and a son having a conversation. And the son says to the mother, "Mom, you remember those 1,100 pieces of silver that went missing from your purse? And it made you so angry that you swore an oath?" And Mom's like, "Yeah, I remember that." And the son says, "Well, forgive me, but I took them. But don't worry, Mom, it's okay. You can have them back because I don't need them anymore." What does that tell you? The very number implies the silver pieces were for Delilah. He had to pay 1,100 pieces of silver to pay the debt owed to the traitor. But somehow, the debt no longer needs paying. Suddenly, the debt is gone. And what's one of the main reasons why a debt disappears? A debt disappears when the creditor disappears. Eh? That's the implication. There's no more Delilah to pay. And I think that's very gently written, but clearly implied. And so all that says is, I'm not trying to tell you Delilah's a wonderful woman that we should admire, because that's not the case. But I'm now beginning to see Delilah very much as much of a victim as Samson. The lords of the Philistines saw that Samson, this huge weapon, was completely besotted with this one woman. So they go to the woman and say, you're going to find out the source of his strength. You're going to do that for us. If she'd have said no and refused, I've no doubt she would just have been killed, so that Samson would fall for another woman. That's what he serially did, and they would use her as the traitor. But once she agrees to the Philistines to hand over Samson, once she's found out his secret, they can't leave her alive. That would set a precedent that would endanger their own lives. So she was going to be killed if she refused, or killed if she accepted. So I do at least see her as a tragic figure that has as much of a victim of that circumstance as Samson. In fact, ironically, she probably died before Samson did. But her death was considered so unremarkable, it's not reported, tragically, in the scriptures. So that's just a little something to think about for Delilah, a little way to perhaps view her a little more sympathetically, even though she was still one of those women who led the wrong way. Now let's go into a much brighter example and look at our leading lady, Esther. Esther, and the first thing we need to know is her name, because there's a lot of wordplay in the book of Esther. Hebrew is a language which often uses wordplay, and there's a lot of it in the Bible. Her name, or her Hebrew name, is Hadassah, and that means myrtle tree. We're going to need to know about that later, but we'll just store that mentally for now. Hadassah, myrtle tree. But the name given her by her essential captors, the Jews have been taken away into captivity in Susa in Iran, and the Persian name that she's been given is Esther. And Esther means star in that language. As a brief aside, it's most probable that Esther is actually based off Ishtar and Mordecai of Marduk, because Ishtar and Marduk are the gods of the Babylonians. And one of the nice things to do if you're Persian and you've beaten the Babylonians to rub their face in it is to take the names of their gods and give them to your slaves or to your pets. That's just, that's a traditional thing when you completely destroy someone else's empire. So most likely, doesn't matter if it's not true, Ishtar and Marduk are the actual sources of the given names Esther and Mordecai for the Jewish captives. Either way, Esther means star in Persian. However, what the Persian captors probably don't know, but we do, is that Esther is also a word in Hebrew. Now, she's not been named Esther in Hebrew, but Esther in Hebrew means hidden. So Esther, she's got three names. She's got her given Hebrew name, myrtle tree. She's got the Persian name, star. But there's this almost accidental name that she's been given. She has a hidden name, which means hidden. And that means, beautifully, you actually have an entire book of the Bible called Hidden. Now, I wish I'd been taught that in Sunday school. Because you tell me in Sunday school there's a book of the Bible called Hidden, I am into that book so hard and fast you can't even believe it. Because I know there's going to be hidden things in there. And there are. We're about to uncover a few of them. I'm sure I haven't found them all. But the idea that there's a book called Hidden is wonderful. And not only is it wonderful, it solves for me a question that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and we still ask it in our own community because there's debate, not amongst ourselves. We accept the canon that we've got, but those who like to try and argue about which book should be in the Bible and which shouldn't often argue, well, God's name does not appear in the book of Esther. And that's true. It doesn't. And so some Christians are like, let's get rid of it because it doesn't speak about God. Actually, there's a lot of godliness in the book of Esther. So much is obvious, I won't even bother to point it out. But it's true that God's name doesn't appear anywhere in the book of Esther. But now we know why. Because all we're saying is, God's name is hidden in the book called Hidden. That's no surprise now, is it? That's almost as it should be. So that's our first discovery from the book called Hidden. And Esther, the one called Hidden, has a hidden agenda. We're going to have a lot of fun uncovering what it is, because I think we know the main storyline of Esther. We'll skip over that quite briefly, but there's some things that I hadn't seen before about what Esther is doing at the end of the book, which shows that she has a hidden agenda, and it's all connected to her tribal ancestry and her rebuilding dignity for her disgraced tribe. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just briefly remind ourselves of the storyline. The king, again, different words exist. Ahasuerus might be the most commonly used one in our community, but I'm going to use Xerxes for various reasons. King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite, who was a wicked man, straight up wicked man. Haman made a law that everyone had to bow to him because he was clearly deeply narcissistic. But Mordecai the Jew refused, because Mordecai says, I bow to my God, not to you. Haman is furious that Mordecai the Jew wouldn't bow, we know this, and so he sets out an entire plan of genocide to wipe out the Jews just because of a personal insult. There's no evidence that Haman is anti-Semitic per se. It's worse than that. He'll go off an insult from one person and say, what nationality is that person? Let's wipe out their entire nationality, because that person's annoyed me. If it pleases the king, says Haman, let a decree be issued to destroy the Jews. To which the king replies, do with the people as you please. These were written in the name of King Xerxes. So Haman was allowed to write his edict using the name of the king and sealed with the king's own ring. What's the relevance of that? You've heard of this, of course. No document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. The law of the Medes and Persians cannot be repealed, cannot be revoked. So this law must now be encoded in the legislature of, well, you thought individuality was a bad word, encoded in the legislature of the Medes and the Persians that the Jews must be destroyed. And Haman ultimately goes on to make a 75-foot gallows on which he wants to publicly execute Mordecai the Jew. Mordecai finds out about this plan, and he pleads with Esther to go into the king and save, or at least appeal, for the Jewish people. But this would result in her risking her life and potentially losing her life, because the king was in a separate palace, and you were not allowed to enter that separate palace without an invitation on pain of death. And if you did, unless the king extended a special golden scepter to you, you would die, as Esther explains. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man to approach the king without invitation, the king has but one law. They be put to death, except they see the golden scepter. 30 days have passed since I was invited to go to the king. But let's take a minute to just consider the leading lady in character. She is a study in courage. I think it was Brother Steve who introduced the idea that Ruth and Joseph were redeemers of their brothers. They fulfilled that part of the life of Christ. We won't look at Ruth this week, but that's certainly true. Jael, as we saw earlier this week, killed the serpent, which kind of foreshadows that little part of the life of Christ. And Deborah was a mother in Israel, which foreshadowed that little part of the life of Christ. Ruth, Jael, Deborah, and others all foreshadow a little bit of the life of Christ. So does Esther. And Esther takes the premier role. She takes Gethsemane. Your life is at risk, and you will likely lose it. Will you lay down your life for the good of God's people? You're safe. You're the queen. Mordecai tries to tell her, you're at risk too, you know, because you're a Jew as well. I don't think Mordecai is correct. I think she would have been fine. She was not at risk personally. And she says, this is the law. Any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned is to be put to death. So Esther says, I accept this mission. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. This is interesting. They're going to fast. For those who say there's no God in the book of Esther, here's evidence that there is. You don't fast unless you believe in a higher power. If you don't believe in a God, there's no point in fasting, right? Your chances of survival aren't higher just because you're hungry, right? This is deliberately an act performed to appeal to a God. This shows her faith in God. So God is clearly in the book of Esther, even though his name is Esther. Okay? When this is done, at the end of the fast, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. The height of courage. It's not just faith. Faith with works of faith. I believe, therefore I act. This is the core. This is literally the center in the verses, the center of the book of Esther. And when Xerxes saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in her hand. So God grants her a victory that she didn't know she would have, but she had faith and she had courage. And let's just compare Esther's move with our own lives. Lest we get too lost in history and not forget that this is for our learning. Let's just run a little comparison. Esther approaches King Xerxes, and we approach King Jesus. A king in some senses, and to become even more of a king in future. Xerxes forbids approach by death. Do not come near me without an invitation, or you will die. Jesus enables our confident approach, invites us towards him at all times. So I'm trying to look at the degree of courage required for Esther versus the degree of courage, virtually none, required for us. Xerxes the king, what's he like as a man? Well, he frequently gets drunk, and when he's drunk, he can rage. We see this in chapter 1. What's our king like? Our king is calm, sober, humble, and godlike. That's the king that we have the pleasure to invite. Xerxes is self-absorbed and manipulable. His advisors will often twist and turn. There are 12 decisions made in the book of Esther. 12 from the royal palace. Xerxes makes only one of them. The other 11 were made by other people manipulating him. Sometimes Haman for evil, sometimes Esther for good. But Xerxes himself was hopeless. But our king judges impartially. He doesn't just listen to gossip or the latest idea. He judges righteously. Righteousness is the girdle of his reins. And Xerxes punishes others when he feels insecure. He threw Vashti out of the kingdom just because she stood up to him when he asked for something crass. Our king rules by justice and mercy. Esther shows huge courage to approach the throne of Xerxes. And that is an exhortation to us. Why? How can we ever be slow or afraid to approach the throne of Jesus? And sometimes we are. We feel unworthy. We feel we have to hang back. We feel reluctant somehow to approach the throne of Christ. How can that be? We have an example of a leading lady who was prepared to risk her own life just to save the lives of her brothers and sisters. What an attitude that would be to turn up on a Sunday morning. Even if I don't want to be there, I might be encouraging my brothers and sisters just with my presence. I don't feel like it, so I'll go for them instead of for me. What a great idea, even a minor reflection of this amazing leading lady. Esther's courage compels us to the throne of Christ, where the golden scepter is always extended. Indeed, the golden scepter isn't even needed because there was no death sentence for approaching Jesus. Jesus took on the death sentence so that we could approach him, which is amazing. The storyline continues. What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to half my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. And Esther immediately does her selfless thing and pleads for the people. She falls at the king's feet and weeps and pleads with him to avert the wicked plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot he devised against the Jews. We have been sold, she says, I and my people, to be destroyed, killed, annihilated. Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this, says the king? A foe, an enemy, says Esther. This wicked Haman, and we're galloping through the plot, but you know it well, so there's no loss here. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. A little bit of ironic justice there. If it pleases the king, says Esther, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman devised and wrote to destroy the Jews. In other words, Haman's genocidal order is still in place, even though Haman is now dead. So when the king says, is there anything else I can do for you? She says, yes, let's write an edict that overrules Haman's edict so that my people don't get destroyed, because that's still encoded in your law. And so the king replies, behold, you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, and you may write in the name of the king and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and seals with the king's ring cannot be revoked. But that's not true, is it? I was never taught this in Sunday school. I wish I had been. The law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked, was revoked by Esther. Esther has overruled the law which cannot be overruled. Haman wrote into the law with the king's seal, the Jews will be wiped out. And Esther said, if it please the king, let's write something that wipes out that edict. And so I was taught that this human law could not be superseded. It was. It's right there in the text. It's an unprecedented level of power in human terms that Esther displays. She has thrown out the law that cannot be thrown out. How that was achieved, I don't know. But the king acceded. In fact, the king said, don't worry, Esther, I'll use the king's seal so your law can never be overturned. That was a stupid thing to say. Because the law he's writing is about to overturn something else he's used the king's seal for. So the king isn't the brightest. But I'm not trying to advertise that. I'm advertising the level of power that God has granted to Esther. Esther, Hadassah, myrtle tree, the hidden one. Here's where we get into what I think is the real jewels, or some of the jewels that I've found hidden in the book of Esther. Come and enjoy them with me. Myrtle tree. Where do we see myrtle tree in Scripture? There's only one place where it's ever used with any spiritual meaning. The angel of the Lord was hidden amongst the myrtle trees and said, I am exceedingly jealous for Jerusalem and for Zion. And here now, back in the time of Esther, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any people or province that they thought might attack them. And this came about because of the zeal of the one called myrtle tree. Because hidden in that myrtle tree was an angel of the Lord, Esther's spirit herself. You see, the wordplay gets complicated. The angel whose zeal saved the Jews was Esther in the Hadassah. Isn't that clever? Hidden in the myrtle tree. Just like it had been back in the time of Zechariah, or the time of Zechariah to come. The angel of the Lord gets hidden among the myrtle trees and says, I'm the one who's zealous for Zion. Because Esther was. He's replaying and showing us how to unlock this rather clever little wordplay. That hidden in the myrtle tree of Hadassah was an angel of the Lord zealous for Jerusalem. Esther there in the one called Esther. That's clever, that's fun, I enjoy that. But there's much more. Because Esther, the one called hidden, has her hidden agenda. And I think it goes back all the way to King Saul. Why would I pick King Saul? The answer is written in the text in front of us, but I just never noticed it. Saul, we know, from 1 Samuel 10, is of the house of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, Benjamin is an interesting tribe. Benjamin was the smallest of the tribes, the youngest of Jacob's children. And Benjamin was a tribe that had some considerable disgrace attached to its name. Judges chapter 19 is the time of the rape murder of this concubine, and the guilty party was a Benjamite, and when Israel went to Benjamin and said, hey, punish these guilty parties, Benjamin said, nah, never mind. And as a result, the rest of Israel was so angry with Benjamin's failure to administer justice that they attacked Benjamin and almost destroyed the whole tribe. So they were a tribe of disgrace. However, their disgrace was turned around because the very first monarch of all Israel was selected by God from the tribe of Benjamin. Finally, our disgrace is reversed, and we have the glory of King Saul. Why does this have anything to do with Esther? Well, because Esther is of the house of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin. It says so directly in these verses. So they're from the same house. There's every possibility Queen Esther is a direct descendant of King Saul. Even if not, she's from the same family. This is her family history. And the problem is, even though Benjamin has the glory of the first king of Israel, that glory was tainted because Saul was a complete failure in everything he did. I'm not going to say Saul was a wicked man, I don't believe he was, but he failed in everything, and God had to reject him. And the tribe of Benjamin that so briefly had some glory was again cast down in disgrace. You had the first king of Israel, and he was a total failure. He lost 2/3 of our land to the Philistines, and Samuel the prophet rejected him and told him that God had rejected him and was going to take the kingdom away from him and give it to another man, a better man than him, from the tribe of Judah. So Benjamin is back in disgrace. What was the source of that disgrace? The principal reason we read about is the failure to kill the king of Amalek. Agag was the king of Amalek, and Saul was told to kill him, and he didn't. God commanded Saul to kill Agag. Thus says the Lord of hosts, go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. But Saul and the people spared Agag. Why is that relevant to the story of Esther? Because it's not just a descendant of King Saul that's in the book of Hidden. Agag is there as well. Remember? Haman, the son of Hammedatha, is the Agagite. It tells us that every time they use his name, so that we'll notice. So Esther versus Haman is Saul versus Agag 2.0, to use modern language, yeah? And Saul failed to kill Agag and brought disgrace on the nation. Esther knows that, and she succeeds in killing Agag, or rather Agag's descendant. They hanged Haman the Agagite on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. So what Esther has done as a small part is she's reversed the failure of her ancestor King Saul. She's begun to remove the indignity and disgrace from the house of Saul. And I think that's what's motivating her. It's an act of love. It's not like, I really want to kill Haman. It's like, I really want to restore my fallen forefather. And if that means killing Haman, so be it. Let's kill Agag, as God always wanted. And so I hadn't noticed that. It was right there in the text. And for some reason, I'd breezed right through the book of Esther 20 times without seeing it. And there's more. Taking the plunder. Esther's law of Purim that she encoded at the king's request with the king's seal said the Jews were allowed to attack their enemies, kill them, and, please notice, in the Purim law, they were allowed to take the plunder of those that they were killed. But they didn't. They laid no hands on the plunder. That verse is so important, that clause is so important, not 5 verses go by, and it says it again in verse 15. But they laid no hands on the plunder. Just in case you missed it, it throws it in the next verse as well. But they laid no hands on the plunder. And by this point I'm like, okay, I get it. Esther's a small book. It's not going to stay small if you say everything 3 times over. But this apparently is so important, it needs to be said 3 times over. Now, I'd noticed the repetition since I was a young man, but I had no idea why I kept having to have hammered home that they didn't take the plunder, even though they were allowed to. But it's obvious why, now thinking about it. That's why. King Saul took Agag's plunder when he shouldn't. Remember? Why then, says Samuel, did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the plunder and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord?
500 years later, Esther can't give back whatever plunder was taken. It's long since disappeared, but what she can do is set up a situation that's opposite, that says, when we go to war, we're allowed to take the plunder, but they laid no hands on the plunder, but they laid no hands on the plunder. They laid no hands on the plunder. And she reverses Saul's failure. And again, she removes some of the disgrace from the house of Saul. It's got nothing to do with plunder. She's a queen. She's got all the riches she needs. She's doing a work of love. But it's all hidden. It's all Estered. Because that's her name. There's a last request. At the end of the day of Purim, there's been a mighty slaughter. No plunder's been taken. A mighty slaughter of the enemies of the Jews. And the king says to her, is there anything else you would like? And she asks for one more day of Purim. And reading the Bible through, I kind of expected her to say, no, that's fine, because she's a godly woman. And then she makes the most bizarre request of all. If it pleases the king, let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. Wow, that's pretty gruesome. Something else you need to realize. I used to think that meant go out, find the 10 sons of Haman, and kill them, and hang them on the gallows. No. When she speaks these words, read carefully, like I almost never do. When she speaks these words, the 10 sons of Haman are already dead. They were already killed on the first, all 10 of them were all killed on the first day of Purim. And at the end of the first day of Purim, and the 10 corpses are already in the royal morgue or whatever, she's saying to the king, please go get those corpses and hang them up around the city. Please. That's what I want. Is that the request of a godly woman? Yes. Does that make sense to you? No. It doesn't make sense to me. Why? Why do something so triumphalist, so gory? Haman's 10 sons were already dead. But that's what happened to Saul. Remember? When Saul died on Gilboa, the Philistines took Saul's body and 3 of his sons and displayed them on the wall at Beth-shan until some noblemen of Israel went and rescued the bodies. Okay, so that's Saul and 3 of his sons. And then many years later, do you remember when David was trying to appease the Gibeonites, he says, what can I do for you? And they said, give us 7 sons of Saul. And by now some are grandsons, but it means the same thing in Hebrew. Give us 7 more sons of Saul. And they were killed, and their bodies were left out in the open, displayed and disgraced and denigrated. Saul and 10 of his sons had their bodies displayed and denigrated by the enemy. Esther avenges the house of Saul. She says, well, then let that happen to this Amalekite. He's already been publicly executed. Get the 10 bodies of his sons and hang them up like they did to my ancestor, like they did to my forefather. And at this point, you might be thinking, that sounds a bit human, doesn't it? Sounds a bit like revenge. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I will repay, not you, Esther. So why is she allowed to? Again, I think it's because she's not about denigrating the Amalekites per se. She's about restoring. This is a work of love. She's restoring and removing the disgrace from the house of Saul. Actually, therefore, there's a wonderful bookend. The first king of Israel was from the tribe of Benjamin, King Saul. You knew that. And from thereafter, they're all from David's line, from the tribe of Judah, all from David's specific line. We know that too. So who's the last king of Judah, of Israel? And we're tempted to say something like Zedekiah, or right? But it's not, because Esther counts. Esther's a Jew. Esther sat on the throne. Esther ruled over the Jews as well as others. The last king of Israel is Queen Esther. She's the omega to Saul's alpha. And so you have this beautiful idea that all the kings of Judah are actually rather attractively bookended by a Benjamite at the front end and a Benjamite at the back end, both from the same family. But King Saul failed to kill Agag. King Saul took Agag's plunder when he shouldn't, and King Saul had his body and 10 sons desecrated in death. And Queen Hidden has a hidden agenda, and she successfully killed the Agagite that King Saul had failed to do. And she didn't take the Agagite plunder, even though she was allowed to. And she took Haman's body and 10 sons and desecrated those in death. And in so doing, she has acted to remove the failure and disgrace from the house of Saul. This was her hidden agenda. So well hidden I could read the book of Esther 50 times and never see it. But reading slowly and carefully, you realize Benjamin has produced a godly monarch at last. In fact, arguably, 2 godly monarchs, because one of them, 500 years later, has had his failure and disgrace removed by the one who was most powerful of all. She was truly born to rule. The last king of Israel was a queen. When all was done, the last became first.